The story of an empire is most often told through its triumphs, its monumental architecture, and the gilded legacies of its sultans and viziers. It is a narrative of power, of conquest, of a civilization that saw itself as the center of the world. But beneath the gleaming domes and the intricate calligraphy of official histories lies another story, a darker and more intimate one. It is a story etched not in stone, but in the stolen lives of its subjects. It is the story of the machine that built the empire, a machine fed not with gold or grain, but with the flesh and spirit of children. To understand the true cost of the Ottoman Golden Age, we must turn away from the throne room and the battlefield, and travel to a place and a time where the empire's grand project began, in the quiet, terrified heart of a 12-year-old boy on the day his world was taken from him. We must ask not how the empire was built, but what it was built from. And the answer, a horrifying and rarely examined truth, is that it was built from the systematic annihilation of innocence. The year is 1550, and in the shadow of the Rhodope Mountains, the village of Oselna breathed with the slow, ancient rhythms of the seasons. Life here was a tapestry woven from threads of hard earth, orthodox faith, and the enduring bonds of kinship. For the boy Stoyan, it was the only universe he had ever known. His world was circumscribed by the cold, clear stream where he and the other boys skipped stones, the dense oak forest where his father taught him to read the tracks of deer, and the whitewashed walls of the village church, its bell a familiar, paternal voice marking the hours of his life. At 12, he stood on the fragile precipice between boyhood and the looming responsibilities of a man. His hands, though still soft, were learning the heft of his father's stonemason tools, and his mind was a repository of his mother's stories, tales of saints and wood spirits, of heroic Bulgarian tsars, and the sorrowful memory of their fall centuries before. The Ottomans were a distant reality, a fact of life like the winter snows or the summer droughts. They were the tax collectors who came and went, the far-off sultan in a city of impossible grandeur, a power too vast and impersonal to truly fear in the cocoon of daily existence. This cocoon was his reality. The smell of baking bread from the communal oven, the sharp scent of pine on the wind, the lowing of cattle returning at dusk. These were the sensory anchors of his identity. His father, Peter, was a man of quiet strength, his character as solid and dependable as the stones he shaped. His mother, Oselna, was the village's memory, her fingers as adept at the loom as her tongue was with the old songs and warnings. Stoyan was their only son, the vessel of their hopes, the future link in a chain of lineage that stretched back into the unrecorded mists of their valley's history. He was loved, he was safe, he belonged. He was Stoyan, son of Peter, of the village of Oselna. This simple, profound truth was the bedrock of his soul. He could not have conceived of a world in which this was not so, any more than he could conceive of the sun rising in the west. The machinery of the state, the grand designs of an empire, were abstractions. But the empire, in its insatiable hunger for loyal servants, was about to make itself brutally, irrevocably real. The arrival of the officials was not a dramatic siege, but a quiet, chilling intrusion. They did not come with drums and banners, but as a small party of men on horseback, their bearing radiating an authority that silenced the village instantly. At their head rode the Turnisibe Sai, the chief crane keeper, an officer of the Janissary Corps whose title belied his grim purpose. He was not here for cranes. He was here to harvest boys. This was the Devshirme, the notorious blood tax, the levy of Christian children who would be taken from their homes, forcibly converted to Islam, and molded into the slaves of the Sultan. For the Ottoman state, it was a stroke of administrative genius, a system for creating a military and bureaucratic elite with no family ties, no regional loyalties, no allegiance to anyone but the Padishah himself. For the Christian communities of the Balkans, it was a recurring nightmare, a specter of loss that haunted every family with healthy, intelligent sons. It was a wound that never healed, a periodic reaping that tore the fabric of their society thread by thread. The villagers knew the process. The priest was summoned, the baptismal records brought forth. The boys between the ages of roughly 8 and 18 were gathered in the central square, before the church where they had been christened into a faith they were about to be forced to renounce. Stoyan stood among them, his hand clutching his father's, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He saw the look on his father's face, not of anger, which would have been understandable, but of a terrifying, soul-crushing impotence. This was a force against which his physical strength was meaningless. The Turnusabasai and his aides moved down the line of boys with the detached air of farmers inspecting livestock. They were looking for the best, the strong, the handsome, the bright-eyed. A hand would cup a chin, forcing a head up. Fingers would probe limbs. A sharp question would be asked, not to be answered, but to judge the quickness in a boy's eyes. When the official's gaze fell upon Stoyan, the world seemed to stop. The man's eyes were like chips of flint, utterly devoid of warmth or malice. They were instruments of assessment. He noted Stoyan's sturdy frame, his clear skin, his straight back. He barked a question in Turkish, a language Stoyan did not understand. The boy just stared, his heart hammering against his ribs. The official grunted, a sound of satisfaction, and gestured with his riding crop. This one, the words were a death sentence for one life and the birth of another. In that instant, Stoyan, son of Petter, ceased to exist in the eyes of the state. He was now a unit of human capital, a piece of imperial property. The aftermath was a blur of primal, soundless screaming. His mother, Oselna, broke through the line of stunned villagers and threw herself at the feet of the officials, her hands clawing at the dust, her voice a raw, animalistic wail of pure agony. It was a sound that would echo in Stoyan's mind for the rest of his life, a ghost of a sound that no distance or time could ever exorcise. 2 guards seized her, pulling her back as she thrashed and sobbed, her fingers reaching for her son. His father stood frozen, a statue of grief, tears carving clean paths through the stone dust on his cheeks. A guard pushed Stoyan forward, joining him with a handful of other selected boys from his and neighboring villages. He did not cry. He did not look back. To look back would be to shatter into a million pieces. The terror was so absolute it had become a kind of calm, a crystalline numbness that encased his soul. He was being led away from the only world he had ever known, and the last thing he saw of his home was his mother's crumpled form on the ground, a small, broken thing in the vast, indifferent landscape. The journey had begun. The column of boys was a river of sorrow flowing towards the imperial heart. They were bound together not by ropes, but by shared loss and bewilderment. They walked for weeks, their soft village shoes wearing through, their feet becoming calloused and bloody. The guards, janissaries who had themselves been taken in a previous levy, treated them with a calculated mixture of neglect and cruelty. There was no sympathy here. To show sympathy would be to acknowledge the horror of their own origins. Instead, they enforced a brutal discipline. Food was scarce, often little more than hard bread and onions. Water was rationed. The nights were cold, and the boys huddled together for warmth, a mass of shivering, homesick bodies under a canopy of alien stars. This was the first stage of their transformation, the deliberate and systematic grinding down of the individual. Stoyan learned the first and most important lesson of his new life on that march. Survival depended on erasure. He learned to swallow his tears, for crying attracted the wrong kind of attention. He learned to make himself small, to observe, to anticipate the moods of their captors. He saw what happened to the defiant ones. A boy who spat at a guard was beaten until he was a whimpering mess, his spirit visibly broken. He saw what happened to the weak. A younger boy who fell ill with a fever was left by the side of the road, his desperate pleas fading as the column marched on, leaving him to the mercy of wolves or exposure. It was a lesson in the brutal calculus of the empire. The unfit were simply discarded. The machine had no use for faulty parts. The journey was also a slow, deliberate process of cultural and spiritual amputation. Their Bulgarian names were now a liability, a link to a past they were being conditioned to forget. The guards began calling them by generic, often insulting, Turkish names. Their faith was the next thing to be stripped away. One evening, halted in a small town, they were herded into the courtyard of a mosque. An imam, stern and unsmiling, lectured them on the tenets of Islam. It was a torrent of incomprehensible words, but the meaning was clear. They were ritually washed, taught the basic movements of prayer, and made to repeat the Shahada, the declaration of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. For Stoyan, the words felt like ashes in his mouth. He thought of the incense-filled church in Oselna, the familiar, comforting face of the Christ Pantocrator on the iconostasis. To repeat these new words felt like a betrayal of his parents, his ancestors, his very soul. But he said them. Every boy said them. To refuse was not an option. It was another choice that was not a choice at all, another step in the hollowing out of his former self. He was learning to perform, to wear a mask, to separate the inner self from the outer shell that was required to live. The arrival in Istanbul was an assault on the senses, a cataclysmic shock that overwhelmed the boy from the small mountain village. After the muted greens and browns of his homeland, the city was a riot of color, sound, and sheer, terrifying scale. The Golden Horn teemed with ships from every corner of the known world. The skyline was a forest of minarets and domes, piercing a sky hazy with the smoke of a million hearths. The streets were a chaotic torrent of humanity. Turbaned merchants, veiled women, haughty janissaries in their distinctive felt hats, beggars, porters, and nobles on horseback. The noise was a physical force, a cacophony of languages, the cries of vendors, the clang of hammers on metal, the braying of donkeys. It was the magnificent, beating, merciless heart of the empire, a place of such immense power and wealth that it seemed to mock the smallness of his personal grief. The boys were not taken to a palace, not yet. They were first quartered in barracks, their journeys in marking the beginning of the final, humiliating stage of their selection. Here, they were stripped of their ragged clothes, scrubbed raw by attendants, and given simple linen tunics. Then came the true inspection. They were led, one by one, into a large cold hall. Waiting for them were several of the most powerful men in the empire, figures of almost mythical authority. Chief among them was the Kapi Aga, the chief white eunuch, the commander of the entire palace interior and the gatekeeper to the Sultan's world. He was a man whose face was a mask of placid command, his eyes holding a terrifying depth of knowledge and power. He, along with other high-ranking officials and surgeons, would decide their fates. The process was invasive and dehumanizing. Each boy was made to stand naked on a small platform. The surgeons examined them with a chilling detachment, looking for any physical imperfection, any sign of disease or weakness. They checked their teeth, their limbs, their genitals. Their intelligence and temperament were also under scrutiny. The Kapi Aga would ask a question, and a boy's reaction, his glance, his posture, the quickness of his reply, was judged. This was the great sorting. The most physically imposing and martial-looking were destined for the Janissary Corps, to become the elite infantry of the Sultan. Others might be sent to work in the imperial gardens, kitchens, or shipyards. A select few, the most handsome and intelligent, were marked for a different path. They were the cream of the crop, destined for the Enderun, the palace school, where they would be trained to become the future administrators, governors, and grand viziers of the Ottoman Empire. When Stoyan's turn came, he felt a cold wave of terror unlike anything he had experienced before. The numbness that had protected him on the journey evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He stood on the platform, his small, naked body shivering under the dispassionate gaze of these powerful men. The surgeon's hands were cold and rough. The Kapi Aga stepped closer, his silk robes whispering against the stone floor. He looked into Stoyan's eyes, a long, unnerving stare that seemed to peel back the layers of his soul. He saw not a boy, but potential. He saw the sharp intelligence that Stoyan tried to hide, the resilience forged in the crucible of the journey, the physical perfection that marked him as prime material. The eunuch spoke a few quiet words to a scribe. A mark was made next to a name Stoyan no longer recognized as his own. He had been chosen. He was to enter the Enderun. It was presented as the highest honor, a golden ticket to a life of unimaginable power and privilege. Stoyan, however, felt no elation. He only felt the cold finality of a door slamming shut on his past, locking him forever inside the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace. The Enderun School was not merely an educational institution. It was a factory for the production of a new kind of man. Located deep within the third courtyard of the Topkapi Palace, the most private and sacrosanct part of the imperial residence, it was a world unto itself. To be an Ikaglan, an inside boy, was to live at the very center of power, yet to be utterly powerless. The curriculum was formidable and all-encompassing. Stoyan, now given the new Turkish name of Iskender, was immersed in a rigorous program designed to forge a perfect servant of the state. He studied the Quran and Islamic theology until the sacred text became as familiar as his own breath. He learned to read and write Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, the languages of religion, administration, and poetry. He was schooled in law, mathematics, geography, music, and the intricate art of calligraphy. His physical training was equally demanding. Horsemanship, archery, wrestling, and the handling of weapons. The goal was to create a Renaissance man in the Ottoman mold, a warrior poet, a devout scholar, and a ruthlessly efficient bureaucrat, all in one. But this education was inextricably intertwined with a system of systematic psychological abuse and indoctrination. The very first principle of the Enderun was the complete and utter erasure of a boy's past. Speaking one's native language was a punishable offense. Mentioning one's family or former life was forbidden. The boys were under the constant, watchful eye of the white eunuchs, who served as their teachers, disciplinarians, and jailers. The eunuchs, men who had been mutilated in the service of the throne, enforced a discipline of absolute silence and obedience. The slightest infraction, a misplaced glance, a moment of inattention, a word spoken out of turn, was met with swift and often brutal punishment. The falaka, a beating on the soles of the feet with a wooden rod, was a common occurrence, a pain designed to be excruciating but to leave no permanent damage that would mar the Sultan's valuable property. This environment fostered not camaraderie, but a predatory hierarchy. The school was divided into a series of chambers or halls, and a boy progressed through them as he aged and advanced in his studies. The older boys, who had internalized the system's brutality, wielded immense power over the younger newcomers. They acted as mentors and tormentors, enforcing the unwritten rules of the palace with a cruelty that often surpassed that of the eunuchs themselves. For a new boy like Iskender, the dormitories were places of profound anxiety. He learned to sleep lightly, to guard his meager possessions, to navigate the complex currents of favor and animosity that governed their cloistered world. Friendship was a dangerous commodity. Any bond of affection between two boys was viewed with deep suspicion by the authorities, seen as a potential locus of loyalty that could compete with their absolute devotion to the Sultan. Such friendships were ruthlessly broken apart, the boys separated and punished, a stark lesson that the only permissible relationship was one of vertical submission to a superior. The psychological impact of this environment was devastating and profound. Iskender, like the others, was being systematically disassembled and reassembled. The boy Stoyan, who loved the smell of pine and the sound of his mother's songs, was being buried alive under layers of new knowledge, new customs, and a new identity that felt like an ill-fitting costume. He became a master of masks. To his instructors, he was the model student, diligent, intelligent, and obedient. His proficiency in languages and his skill in archery earned him praise, which was a form of armor. To his peers, he was quiet, watchful, and remote. He learned that to show vulnerability was to invite predation, and to show ambition was to create rivals. He built a fortress of silence around the small, terrified core of his being, a place where the memories of Oselna were kept like forbidden, sacred relics. Yet, the most insidious aspect of the Enderun was its corruption of desire and affection. In this all-male environment, where natural emotional and physical outlets were denied, a warped and predatory economy of intimacy flourished in the shadows. While the eunuchs policed the boys' own attachments with ferocious vigilance, it was an open secret that powerful courtiers, pashas, and even the Sultan himself often selected pages from the Enderun for their personal service, a service that frequently extended into the sexual sphere. Beauty in a boy was both a passport to advancement and a terrible vulnerability. The boys learned this unspoken language of glances, of favors, of patronage. They saw how a handsome classmate might suddenly be elevated, given better clothes and duties, after catching the eye of a visiting vizier. It was a system that taught them that their bodies, like their minds and spirits, were not their own. They were instruments to be used, commodities to be traded for power and position. This was the ultimate lesson in dehumanization. To survive and to thrive, one had to learn to sell pieces of one's soul. As Iskender grew from a boy into a teenager within these suffocating walls, the moral dilemmas of his existence became sharper and more painful. He excelled in his studies, his mind a keen blade honed by the palace's demanding curriculum. He could debate theology in Arabic, compose poetry in Persian, and calculate artillery trajectories with precision. He was becoming the perfect product of the imperial machine. But with each success, the ghost of Stoyan grew fainter, his sense of self more fractured. He would sometimes catch his reflection in a polished brass tray or a basin of water and see a stranger staring back. A handsome, composed young man in the silks of a palace page, his face a carefully constructed mask of discipline. But behind the eyes there was a void. He grappled with the faith that had been forced upon him. Was his devotion real? Or was it merely the most elaborate performance of his life? He prayed 5 times a day, his forehead touching the cool marble of the palace mosque, but he did not know who or what he was praying to. He was trapped between a world he could no longer reclaim and a world he could never truly belong to, a world whose price of admission was his own humanity. The palace was a universe of calculated surfaces, where every gesture was laden with meaning and every relationship was a transaction. Iskender learned to navigate this treacherous landscape with a preternatural skill born of constant fear. He observed how power flowed, not through official channels, but through whispers in corridors, through strategic gifts, through the subtle patronage of the mighty. He saw how a single word from the chief black eunuch could ruin a general, or how the favor of the Sultan's current favorite could elevate a stable boy to a position of influence. It was a world of snakes and ladders, where a misstep could lead to oblivion. He kept his head down, distinguished himself through merit, and avoided the dangerous entanglements of palace factions. His goal was simple and stark, to survive. But as he entered his late teens, his exceptional combination of intelligence and striking good looks made him impossible to ignore. Survival, through quiet competence, was no longer an option. He was becoming too valuable a commodity, and the predators of the court were beginning to circle. The turning point, the moment that represented the final, irrevocable death of his innocence, came not with a beating or a public humiliation, but in the quiet opulence of a private chamber. Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, a powerful vizier on the imperial council, was a man renowned for his military victories, his vast wealth, and his discerning taste in art, poetry, and beautiful things. He had noticed Iskender during a review of the senior pages. The boy's flawless Persian recitation had caught his ear, but it was his appearance, the proud bearing, the intelligent eyes, the physical grace of a trained athlete, that had captured the Pasha's full attention. It was the kind of attention that every page in the Enderun learned to recognize and to dread. It was a gaze that did not see a person, but an object of desire, a potential acquisition. The summons came through the Kapiaga. It was not a request, but a command. Iskender was to attend the Pasha in his private apartments within the palace complex that evening. No reason was given, but none was needed. The air in the Enderun dormitory was thick with unspoken knowledge as Iskender prepared himself. He bathed, scented his skin with musk, as was expected, and donned the fine silk robes provided for the occasion. The other boys avoided his eyes. In their silence, he saw a mixture of pity, envy, and fear. They all knew the nature of this summons. They knew it was a crossroad. To please the Pasha meant patronage, protection, and a guaranteed path to a high-ranking post upon graduation from the Enderun. It meant an escape from the brutal anonymity of the school and an entry into the world of real power. To refuse, or to fail to please, was unthinkable. It would mean being cast back into the darkness, marked as insolent and ungrateful. It would be a career-ending and possibly life-ending act of defiance. Walking through the silent, torch-lit corridors of the palace, Iskender felt a profound and chilling clarity. The scared, weeping boy from Oselna was long dead. The confused, struggling adolescent was also gone. In their place stood a young man who understood the mechanics of this world with brutal precision. He felt no rage, no fear, only a vast, empty coldness. This was simply the final price. He had already given them his name, his family, his faith, and his freedom. What was left was merely the husk. He was led by a silent eunuch into the Pasha's chambers. The room was a treasure cave of luxury. Thick Persian carpets muffled his footsteps, silver lanterns cast a soft, shimmering light, and the air was heavy with the scent of incense and spices. Hafiz Ahmed Pasha was reclining on a divan, a cup of wine in his hand. He was an older man, his face a web of fine lines that spoke of both intellect and dissipation. He smiled, a gesture that held no warmth, only a sense of ownership. The Pasha spoke of poetry, of philosophy, of the boy's promise. The words were a delicate, civilized veneer over a raw and ugly reality. Iskender answered his questions with the polite, deferential intelligence that was expected of him. He was performing his role perfectly. But all the while, he was detaching himself, retreating into the last, inviolable fortress of his mind. He was observing the scene as if from a great distance. He saw a powerful man and a beautiful boy. He saw a transaction about to be completed. When the Pasha finally set aside his wine cup and beckoned him closer, Iskender obeyed without hesitation. There was no struggle, no protest. The act itself was a quiet, suffocating violation, a final confirmation that he was nothing more than property, an object to be used for another's pleasure. In that moment of submission, the last flickering ember of Stoyan was extinguished. He had not merely lost his innocence. He had been forced to actively participate in its ritual murder. He had become a willing cog in the machine that had consumed him. The immediate aftermath was a shift in his entire existence. As the sun rose over the Bosphorus, Iskender walked back to the Enderun barracks not as a victim, but as a player in the game. He had survived the encounter, and in doing so, had secured his future. Within days, the change was made manifest. He was officially assigned to Hafiz Ahmed Pasha's personal retinue, elevated from the ranks of the common pages to a position of immense privilege. He was moved to more luxurious quarters. His clothing was of finer material, his meals were of better quality, and the eunuch instructors who had once terrorized him now treated him with a deferential respect that bordered on fear. They all recognized him for what he now was, the protege of one of the most powerful men in the empire. The elevation was a public spectacle, and its true cause was a truth hidden in plain sight. The official narrative, the one that would be recorded in palace registers, was that the gifted page Iskender had been rewarded for his extraordinary diligence and talent. His promotion was presented as a shining example of the Enderun's meritocratic ideal. This was the propaganda of the system, the carefully constructed lie that masked the rod at its core. The reality was a sordid secret that everyone knew and no one spoke. The entire system was built on such deceptions, on the glaring contradiction between the empire's grand image of justice and piety and the brutal, exploitative reality of its inner workings. Iskander's success was now part of that grand deception. He was living proof of the lie. His relationship with the other boys was irrevocably altered. The few he had considered near friends now regarded him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He was no longer one of them. He had crossed a threshold, and the price of his passage was written on his face, in the new, cold authority in his eyes. He had become part of the very power structure that oppressed them. He was now a gatekeeper, a figure to be envied and feared. He had traded his soul for security, and in the brutal economy of the palace, it was considered a bargain. The boy from Oselna, who once skipped stones with his friends by a clear mountain stream, was now an architect of his own gilded cage, complicit in the system that had unmade him. In the years that followed, Iskander's ascent was swift and inexorable. Under the Pasha's patronage, he graduated from the Enderun with distinction and was given a commission in the Sipahi cavalry, then a junior administrative post. He proved to be as ruthless and efficient as the system had designed him to be. The watchfulness he had learned as a terrified boy in the dormitory became a keen political instinct. The emotional detachment he had cultivated as a defense mechanism made him a cold and effective commander and negotiator. He moved through the ranks of the Ottoman hierarchy, his past a sealed and forgotten country. He became a pasha himself, a governor of a wealthy province, a commander in the Sultan's endless wars. He acquired wealth, power, and prestige. He was, by every measure of his world, a success. He was the embodiment of the Devshirme's promise, a shepherd's boy transformed into a prince of the empire. But the empire's grand narrative of meritocracy is a profoundly dishonest one. It celebrates the few who reach the summit while consigning the countless who were crushed by the process to historical silence. For every Sokolum Mehmed Pasha, the Serbian boy who rose to become Grand Vizier, there were thousands of boys who died on the march, who were broken by the discipline, who languished in obscurity, or who were consumed by the palace's predatory culture. The system was not designed to create happy or whole men. It was designed to create loyal and effective instruments of state power. It was a process of alchemy that sought to turn the base metal of human life into the gold of imperial service, and it did not care how much dross was burned away in the process. It was a cultural and spiritual genocide, enacted on an individual level, over and over again for centuries. This is the brutal paradox that lies at the heart of the Devshirme. It was simultaneously a vehicle for incredible social mobility and an engine of profound human suffering. Historians can debate its effectiveness as a tool of statecraft, pointing to the stability and loyalty it fostered in the Ottoman elite. But such a debate risks obscuring the fundamental moral horror of the practice. It was a system predicated on the theft of children, on the violent severance of the most basic human bond, that between parent and child. It was a state-sanctioned, institutionalized program of kidnapping, forced conversion, and psychological reprogramming. The splendor of the Topkapi Palace, the victories of the Janissaries, the efficiency of the Ottoman bureaucracy, all were paid for with the stolen childhoods of boys like Stoyan. To understand this history is to look past the official portraits of the stern, bearded viziers in their silken robes, and to try to see the lost boys they once were. It is to recognize that behind the mask of power and success was often a hollowed-out man, a ghost haunted by a life he was forced to forget. The story of Stoyan, who became Iskander, is the story of them all. It is a cautionary tale about the nature of power and the price of empire. It reminds us that history's grandest structures are often built upon foundations of personal tragedy, and that the cost of civilization is frequently paid by its most vulnerable. One can imagine Iskander Pasha in his old age, a man laden with honors, wealth, and the weariness of a long, brutal life. He might stand on the marble balcony of his palace in Damascus or Cairo, looking out at the city he governs in the Sultan's name. He has everything a man of his time could desire. He is feared, respected, and powerful. But perhaps in the quiet moments between the calls to prayer, when the wind blows in a certain direction, he can still hear a faint, distant sound carried across the years and the miles. It is not the clash of swords or the murmur of the imperial court. It is the sound of a woman's scream in a dusty Bulgarian village, a cry of absolute loss. It is the ghost of a sound that all the power and glory of the empire could never truly silence. The last, indelible echo of the boy he was forced to kill in order to live.